Medical science cannot explain phys. Lance Naik Hanamanthappa Koppad. The 9th of February 2016, 1226 hours. Of the 10 soldiers presumed dead in #Saikan, 1 has survived. Lance Naik Hanamanthappa is critical. Pray for him. What a miracle. The late-night flash on social media by newspaper correspondent Rahul Singh galvanized a country that had spent a week in mourning. TV news channels broke out of their regular recorded late-night programming. Across the internet, a ripple of disbelief churned into a tide. Was this even humanly possible? Prime Minister Narendra Modi was nowhere close to turning in for the night. 2 hours earlier, at his Racecourse Road residence, he had received a call from the then Army Chief, Gen. Dalbir Singh. The conversation lasted barely a few minutes. And when it ended, it was not necessary for the Prime Minister to say it. He knew that the army, already grieving over the loss of its men, would do everything in its power to save the superhuman they had pulled out alive after 6 days of being buried under more than 25 feet of snow, 6 days at temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius under a terrifying block of blue, unforgiving ice. From the moment it happened, the Prime Minister had demanded a daily briefing of the rescue operation 20,500 feet high on the northern glacier near Saikan. Saikan Glacier, Jammu and Kashmir, the 2nd of February 2016. The 10 army men, including 8 from the 19th Battalion of the Madras Regiment, had hiked up to Sonam Post just 2 months before. Sonam, one of the highest permanently manned military posts in the world, sits way up on the Saltoro Ridge that overlooks the Saikan Glacier to the east and Pakistan-occupied territories to the west. Named for Havildar Sonam, an intrepid Ladakhi soldier who braved unspeakable weather and Pakistani fire to occupy the point in 1984, the Sonam post offers soldiers a magnificent position of advantage, but is also fully exposed to what is literally the worst weather on Earth. Not to speak of insidious crevasses and devastating avalanches similar to the one that came crashing down on the 10 army men early on the 3rd of February. While some of the men were on observation and guard duty, the others were in the tents. And none of them even saw it coming. An enormous block of ice shattered the ridgeline above them and came rumbling down the mountainside, completely burying the post. The men at Sonam Post had arrived in the Saikan area in October 2015. Including nursing assistant Sepoy Sunil Sayawanshi of the Army Medical Corps, the team comprised team leader and head of the post, Subedar H. Havildar Alumalai, Lance Havildar S. Kumar L. N.K. Sadish B., Sepoy Mahesha P.N., Sepoy Gainsan G., Sepoy Ramamurthy N., Sepoy Mustaq Ahmed S. and L. N.K. Hanamanthappa Koppad. The men had been handpicked in December to take position at Sonam. The choice was not random. Col. Bahadur Gurung, CO of 19 Madras, had chosen them for what everyone on the glacier knew was the most demanding deployment possible. Soldiers deployed for high-altitude warfare are frequently the most resilient men. The 10 chosen to pitch the tents at 20,500 feet for a few months represented the cream of the crop. Politics and tragedy have occasionally thrust Saikan into the national discourse. But away from the diplomatic aggression over the northern glacier areas, it remains the Army's enduring regret that few truly understand what it means to even operate in such terrain, far less engage in combat. It is not without reason that Saikan has earned the epithet, frozen hell. Soldiers deployed to high-altitude posts do not only have to be rigorously trained in the art of warfare in the most devious, unforgiving terrain imaginable, but they also need to be highly skilled in survival and sustenance. In addition, every man has to be psychologically conditioned so he does not run the risk of losing his mind at those altitudes. The training regimen and deployment schedules for India's glacier units have been tailored over time to account for the worrying effects that spending long periods at those heights can have on men. They were all incredibly brave men, says Col. Dinesh Singh Tanwir, who, as 2IC of 19 Madras when the avalanche struck, operated from the operations room established at Saikan Base Camp established under the base commander Col. Hari Haran, about 90 minutes away from Sonam Post by helicopter. These guys were the best of the lot. Motivated and fit. When you go to the glacier, the fear of the unknown overpowers all other fears. We know where the enemy is, but we don't know where avalanches will come from, or where the crevasses are. We can't take anything for granted, he says. The monstrous visitor at Sonam Post on the morning of the 3rd of February was a slab avalanche, the most sinister kind. Formed by an enormous 800 x 1000 meter block of snow fracturing away from the mountain, it had buried the post up to 25 to 30 feet deep in mere seconds. Where the tents once stood, now there was nothing but scattered debris of blue ice boulders harder than rock. The wind dropped suddenly, as it ironically always does after an avalanche, filling the thin air above Sonam Post with a cold silence. That was all March. Vipin Kumar, the company commander, posted a short distance below Sonam Post, heard on his radio set. The major, who would get a radio report from the men at Sonam Post each morning at 0400 hours, had heard nothing that morning. He was not immediately worried. The sub-zero temperatures frequently paralyzed equipment, and radio sets sometimes needed to be warmed up artificially before they would work again. Over an hour later, there was still no word. Then, at 0515 hours, a feeble voice cracked through the radio. Saab, Humdab, Gahain, sir, we have been buried. It was Havildar Alumalai. Originally from a Dukumparai village in faraway Tamil Nadu, Alumalai was now buried under a wall of snow 20 feet deep. He had miraculously been able to reach for his radio set and transmit the news. March. Vipin knew instantly what had happened. Exactly a month before, on the 3rd of January, 4 army men had perished in a similar avalanche on the Saikan Glacier. Havildar Dorje Gasson, Havildar Swang Norbu, Rifleman Jigmat Kostap and Rifleman Muhammad Yusuf had died instantly. The voice from Sonam Post, however, suggested there was hope. The major did not waste another moment. He immediately formed a rescue party before alerting his CO, Col. Gurung, who was at the Kumar Post at an altitude of over 15,000 feet. He in turn relayed the message up the chain of command via the Saikan Glacier's Independent Infantry Brigade onto the 14 Corps in Leh, the Army's Northern Command headquarters at Udhampur, and finally to the Army headquarters in Delhi. An early riser, Army Chief Gen. Dalbir Singh was about to go for a morning run when he received word about the avalanche. Cancelling his exercise routine, he immediately began to get ready to dash to his headquarters at South Block. 10 army men at this lofty military post had been deluged in a terrifying flood of ice. The government leadership needed to be notified immediately. It was the first thing he needed to do. As March. Vipin and his men gathered troops from other posts and headed straight for Sonam. Lower down at Saikan Base Camp, a makeshift coordination center was set up under the unit's 2IC, Col. Dinesh. Soldiers at the base camp had been preparing for their own induction into high-altitude posts. Everything would now have to focus on the tragedy at Sonam Post. 2 hours later, March. Vipin and his team arrived at the site. It would take them whole moments to digest the scene. The enormous debris field from the avalanche had gorged on every visible aspect of the post. There was nothing left to see. It was a scene of devastation the men would never forget. Helicopters soon brought in more personnel, this time doctors and ace army mountaineers. They arrived bearing metal detectors, excavation equipment and specially trained avalanche rescue dogs. By noon on the 3rd of February, a team of nearly 50 personnel were at the site of the tragedy. This in itself was an enormous logistical challenge. Sonam Post, which was suitable for no more than 10 men, was now not only completely destroyed and buried, but had 50 men who could not leave any time soon. In coordination with Col. Dinesh's team at Saikan Base Camp, the rescue teams needed to organize tents, water, medicine and rations for themselves. There could be no oversights at this juncture. We had to plan very carefully. These men were about to engage in hard labor at 20,500 feet. If we made errors, we could easily suffer further casualties, says Col. Dinesh. Accompanied by dogs and machinery and with prayers on their lips, the men began digging through the vast icy sheet of debris at Sonam Post in temperatures that forced them to take frequent breaks just to be able to flex their fingers and limbs. If frostbite or altitude sickness set in, it would not just damage the rescue effort, but would also place an exponentially bigger burden on the base camp to rescue the rescuers themselves. By 1455 hours on the 3rd of February, the media got wind of the disaster that had struck Sonam Post. Having just reported the deaths of 4 army men a month before, the news flashes sounded grim. At 20,500 feet, the rescue effort continued till sundown. The night brought fresh snowfall and winds of unspeakable ferocity, forcing the large rescue team to hunker down into the tents. There was no question of searching through the night. The men spent an uncomfortable night, the tents buffeted by a howling draft, fully aware that every hour they spent unable to search was an hour closer to the end for the 10 soldiers buried under several feet of ice. If the end hadn't already arrived for them, that is. At first light on the 4th of February, the men set to work again. Shortly after 1,100 hours, the Army headquarters in Delhi put out the first of several updates on a rescue effort that would, in a matter of days, mesmerize the entire country. The men saw and heard nothing as they continued to dig and scour through the icy debris on the 4th of February. Trained not to yield to despair even in the most hopeless conditions, the rescue teams could not help but be skeptical about the men surviving a full day under all that ice. Was this really a race against time anymore, or simply an exercise to find 10 corpses? It did not matter. The Indian Army never leaves its men behind. Then, when they were least expecting it, a radio set with one of the rescuers crackled, a broken voice emerging from it. It was Sepoy Ramamurthy N. Like Havildar Alumalai the previous day, the Sepoy from Gudisatanapalli village in Tamil Nadu had managed to find his radio and make a call. The rescue team had not been able to raise a sound out of Alumalai since they arrived on the scene, making him fear the worst, but not slowing him down. The call from Ramamurthy exploded through the rescue team at Sonam Post, dusting every bit of despair from their shoulders. The men doubled up, focusing every resource on trying to pin down Ramamurthy's location under the ice. He stayed in contact with us for 2 hours, but he was unable to tell us exactly where he was, recalls Col. Dinesh, a steady sadness in his voice. He tried very hard, but he couldn't direct us. He could have been upside down for all we knew. Both he and the teams knew his radio set would be out of batteries soon. Shortly before 2,100 hours that night, Sepoy Ramamurthy went silent. A team from the Siachen Battle School had arrived that day too, carrying special sensor systems that were capable of seeing through walls of ice. The new team had also brought tree cutters to slice through the ice with greater efficiency as they raced against time. By the time Ramamurthy's radio transmissions died out from under the snow, the rescue team had swelled to 110 strong. A team of 50 civilian porters had also been employed to help transport equipment to the site. The voice from below had acted as a booster dose of hope to the rescue team. But the silence that followed threatened to drag them down again. Search operations continued till late that night and for the following 2 days. For over 48 hours, the men saw nothing and heard nothing. Every pair of ears over the debris field strained to pick up any sounds. Some men put their ears directly to the ice, hoping to hear something, anything from below. By the evening of the 7th of February, 5 days after the avalanche, the team had dug 3 40-feet-deep holes straight through the avalanche remnant. We were fighting to pinpoint any location that could give us a clue about the men below, recalls Col. Dinesh. Then at 1,800 hours on the 7th of February, we saw something. A team suspended on one of the shafts had spotted a cable sticking out from the side of the hole. It was a communication cable. In 5 days of digging, it was the first physical object the team had found below the devastation. It was obvious we had to follow the cable, says a mountaineer member of the rescue team at Sonam Post. Digging further vertically was very difficult. The shaft was unstable too. We lowered barrel halves above us so the shaft wouldn't cave in with us inside. With the blue ice threatening to crumble and bury them inside the shafts any moment, the men began carefully excavating a horizontal tunnel to follow the cable they had found. Night arrived quickly, bringing with it the most vicious winds the men had encountered that week at the site. Rappelling up the shaft, they rushed to the tents, with no choice but to suspend the search for another night. The team knew it had found something that could lead to the buried soldiers. Few slept that night. At first light on the 8th of February, shaft work resumed. They were chilled to the bone, but members from the team remember an unusually calm morning bringing with it a palpable sense of hope in the shadow of the fractured ridgeline. They trudged to the shafts, lowering themselves once again to continue tunneling, carefully following the communication cable through the icy darkness. Special halogen lamps on their helmets cast a grim glow on the featureless, solid ice they were cutting through. It was not until noon on the 8th of February that the team had its first big breakthrough. Through the dark portal, created by ceaselessly drilling horizontally through the ice slab, they spotted a piece of tent. They did not hear a sound, but they knew they had to be very close to the men they were looking for. The excavation continued for another 5 hours until they had gained access right into the snow-filled tent. As the shaft groaned once again with the shifting of ice, they spotted the first body. After 6 days in the snow, this was the first of the 10 men they had seen. Carefully, the body was removed from the tent. It was cold, stiff, unmoving. Another 3 hours passed before the rescuers reached the next body deep within the tent. But as they took hold of the body to move it through the shaft, the rescuers realized something that stopped them in the tracks. The soldier was breathing. Calling for an emergency evacuation, the body was quickly prepared and eased out through the horizontal tunnel, and then carefully up the long shaft to the surface, strapped to one of the mountaineers. The man was L.N.K. Hanamanthappa Koppad. Far from his hometown in Karnataka's Dharwad district, the soldier had been pulled out alive and conscious after 144 hours under nearly 25 feet of murderous ice. The disbelief among his rescuers had to wait. They needed to get him to safety as quickly and delicately as possible. We immediately rushed him to the medical tent that had been set up with 3 doctors. He was provided humidified oxygen, warm intravenous fluids and passive warming from the outside. We could not risk anything else at that point, as he was clearly in shock, says one of the rescuers. L.N.K. Koppad was as medically critical as it was possible to be, but his body had sustained itself for 6 days under the avalanche debris. Not a soul slept that night at Sonam Post. Inside the medical tent, the army doctors took turns to watch over L.N.K. Koppad to help him survive the night. Now in an open space, they feared his body would sink into further shock. If he did, it would be impossible to revive him. By midnight on the 8th of February in Delhi, the news of L.N.K. Koppad's survival had broken on social media, rapidly becoming an overnight sensation. It would be the biggest story the following day. Across newsrooms, journalists were designated to track the rescue operation and feed the news machine as rapidly as possible. On the internet, L.N.K. Koppad was instantly hailed as a miracle man and a hero. A soldier from the hot tropical south, selflessly deployed at death-defying altitudes and temperatures in India's extreme north, had survived while standing guard in the service of his country's sovereignty. In equal measure, L.N.K. Koppad had stunned, shamed and captured the nation's imagination. Shamed because his survival had come as a shattering, unexpected reminder of how little public or political attention was ever paid to soldiers who stood sentinel at the country's most dangerous forward areas. Late that night in Betadur village, the Lance Naik's hometown, L.N.K. Koppad's family would learn about his miraculous survival from television news. His wife, Mahadevi, had spent the week in mourning, hopeful but quite certain her husband had not survived. A neighbor who visited the Koppad household that night later told a Kannada TV news station that Mahadevi was momentarily paralyzed by the news, too terrified to believe it could really be true, wondering if someone was playing a cruel prank on her. She picked up her baby daughter, Netra, and wept as late-night celebrations began outside her house. Nearly 2,000 kilometers away, her husband spent the night in the green glow of the medical tent, an oxygen mask over his face. Early the next morning, barely conscious as he was strapped to a stretcher with a cylinder of oxygen by his side and a doctor for company, L.N.K. Koppad was flown in a cheetah helicopter to the Siachen base camp. Col. Tanweer recalls the unforgettable moment he met L.N.K. Koppad in the specialty medical tent he was shifted to. He was conscious, Col. Tanweer says. I held his hand and he pressed my hand. His eyes were open. He had energy in him even after everything he had been through. I strongly believed he would survive. The colonel did not know what to say, but found himself telling L. NK Koppad Tambi Tuje Kuch Nahi Hoga Tu Fik Ho Jayega. Koi Dikit Nahi Hai Tambi Tu Bilkul Fik Ho Jayega. Nothing will happen to you, young brother. There is no problem. You will be absolutely fine. After a rapid medical check to make sure the flight down from Sonam Post had not further compromised his vitals, L.N.K. Koppad was quickly loaded into another army cheetah and flown at full speed to Thois, a military airfield that functions as the lifeline and gateway to the northern glaciers. Nestled in Ladak's Shiak Valley, Thois is an acronym for Transit Halt of Indian Soldiers en route to Siachen, and is barred to civilians. When the cheetah landed at Thois, an Indian Air Force C-130J Super Hercules from the 77 Veiled Vipers squadron was already waiting for it. It had made the 90-minute flight from the Hindon Air Force Base on Delhi's outskirts early that morning and was carrying specialized life support equipment and a critical care specialist from the Indian Air Force. Its 4 engines whipping up dust over the high-altitude airfield, the aircraft roared off the tarmac minutes after receiving perhaps its most special passenger till date. Shortly post-noon, the C-130J landed at Delhi's Palam Air Force Base, the military and VIP terminal co-located with the Indian capital's Indira Gandhi International Airport. A super specialty ambulance from the Army Hospital Research and Referral was waiting to receive L.N.K. Koppad. In a convoy with priority access, the ambulance tore down the short 5 kilometers to the sprawling hospital complex, carrying L.N.K. Koppad strapped to his stretcher in a thick sleeping bag, passing through a crowd of television cameras and journalists that had collected in large numbers outside the hospital to capture the media's first glimpse of Siachen's heroic survivor. Lieutenant Gen. S.D. Dewan, then commandant of the Army R&R Hospital, had seen nothing like this in his 38-year medical career in the military. And he had seen some amazing things. He stared at L.N.K. Koppad in disbelief, wondering how the 32-year-old had defied all odds to stay alive. Medical science simply cannot explain how he survived at that altitude. It cannot. Remember, 9 others had died, Lieutenant Gen. Dewan says. L.N.K. Koppad was a man of incredible physical and mental courage. People have survived in those conditions for a day or 2. But 6 days. I have been through volumes of literature but have found no such instance, says Lieutenant Gen. Dewan, who supervised the specialists attending to the soldier. The soldier was immediately wheeled into the hospital's ICU. 30 minutes after treatment began, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Army Chief Gen. Dalbir Singh arrived at the hospital. The soldier had slipped into a coma. At his side in the ICU, the Prime Minister listened in silence as the doctors explained what L.N.K. Koppad had endured. The Lance Naik had been recovered alive and conscious, but he was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, hypoxic, hypoglycemic and in shock. Comatose and in a precarious situation. The soldier also had severe pneumonia. Making matters worse, he had developed signs of liver and kidney dysfunction. One saving grace, the Prime Minister was told, was that L.N.K. Koppad had miraculously escaped frostbite and bone injuries. The bodies of some of the other men in that same tent had been recovered crushed by the block of snow that buried them. In an enormously unlikely stroke of luck, L.N.K. Koppad had managed to be caught in a tiny space between the ground and the ice slab, giving him a small bubble of oxygen to live on. Surviving in that position for a few hours, maybe even a day, was conceivable. How he did it for 6 days is something medical specialists, mountaineering legends and his comrades at 19 Madras can only guess about. It wasn't just about physical endurance. I like to think Hanamanthappa's belief in his team, his seniors and the army pulled him through, says Col. Tanweer, who, at the time of writing this book, was deployed in a different sector of Ladakh, this time along the border with China. He believed in his training and didn't let despair or exhaustion force him to give up. On primetime television that night on the 9th of February, anchors and reporters drafted medical experts into the studios to make sense of the miracle man of Sonam Post. A sense of hope and disbelief would pervade coverage late into the night. We can talk all we want to about what happened, says Lieutenant Gen. Dewan. But, for a moment, picture being buried in total darkness under a mountain of ice with nothing for company but the sound of your own voice. He paused, nodding. Now imagine the same thing for 6 days. Late that evening, N.K. Koppad's wife, daughter and extended family landed in Delhi. Received by an army vehicle and once again thronged by journalists, they were driven straight to the army R&R hospital where N.K. Koppad lay. A smiling but anxious Mahadevi would speak more confidently to television journalists this time. It is a day of joy for me and my family, but let us never lose sight of the tragedy for 9 other families. The spotlight had shifted to Delhi, but search operations for the other men continued at Sonam Post and would not stop until all 9 bodies had been recovered. By midnight, the team of doctors attending to N.K. Koppad decided on a more intensive course of medical action to revive the soldier. It was a single notion that powered him on. If he had survived so much, surely he could make it. Surely, he was special. Enlisting himself with the army at a recruitment camp in 2002, N.K. Koppad had immediately proven himself a tough infantryman. The year after he joined the army, he was sent on counter-terror duties in the Kashmir Valley where he spent 3 years. He would return on a 4-year tour in 2008. In 2010, he was packed off to the northeast for counterinsurgency operations. It had become clear to his seniors that N.K. Koppad was a tough soldier ready for greater operational challenges. Which was why when a 10-man team was to be selected in December 2015 to man Sonam Post, N.K. Koppad's name was a shoe-in. Mahadevi and her family visited a temple and prayed late into the night on the 9th of February. They had been reassured by the army doctors, but knew that N.K. Koppad's condition was extremely delicate. The hope that N.K. Koppad's rescue had brought to Mahadevi had both energized and terrified her. On the one hand, it was a magical moment of joy and relief. On the other, the reality of his condition made it likely that her joy would be short-lived. The next morning, the army provided a brief update on the soldier's condition. N.K. Hanamanthappa Koppad continues to battle the odds and his condition remains very critical. The medical team treating him is monitoring his situation continuously and is treating him with expertise available in the world. By this time, a panel of medical experts from Delhi's renowned All India Institute of Medical Sciences had arrived to inspect the soldier's condition, joining critical care specialists, a nephrologist and a senior neurologist. In a span of a few hours, the news from inside the hospital took a sharp turn for the worse. Doctors had discovered evidence of oxygen deprivation in N.K. Koppad's brain from a CT scan. The tone of the new medical bulletin that followed strongly suggested that the soldier's condition was no longer within medical control. There is evidence of pneumonia in both lungs. His multi-organ dysfunction state continues unabated. His condition has deteriorated despite aggressive therapy and supportive care. Prime Minister Modi received a briefing on the soldier's health that evening. The army informed him in no uncertain terms that saving N.K. Koppad was going to prove next to impossible. When the Prime Minister inquired if there were any other medical avenues that still existed for the soldier, the army assured him that N.K. Koppad was receiving the best possible treatment that existed anywhere in the world. Early next morning, the army released its final medical bulletin on N.K. Koppad. It would spare no details and soften no words. Extremely critical with worsening multiple organ dysfunction. His circulatory shock is now refractory to all drugs in maximum permissible doses and his kidneys remain non-functional. His pneumonia has worsened and his blood clotting disorder shows no sign of reversal despite blood component support. He is on maximal life support with aggressive ventilation and dialysis. He has slipped into a deeper state of coma. Mahadevi and the family were escorted to the hospital before noon. At 1145 hours, N.K. Koppad stopped fighting for his life. An unusual eruption of nationwide mourning broke out that Thursday in February 2016. Amplified by a media that refused to move away from the story. N.K. Koppad's death had, for a moment, sobered millions. Later that day, N.K. Koppad's remains were placed in a casket and taken to Brass Square, the ceremonial army compound in Delhi reserved for the last rites of military personnel. Politicians do not normally attend wreath-laying ceremonies for soldiers. For L.N.K. Koppad, they all did. The long line of government and state leaders would include the Prime Minister himself. Before he arrived, he tweeted a brief message. He leaves us sad and devastated. Rip Lance Naik Hanamanthappa. The soldier in you remains immortal. Proud that martyrs like you served India. L.N.K. Koppad's wife was amazingly strong. For her, the soldier had died for the second time in a matter of a few days, recalls Lieutenant Jen Doohan. When news of his death was broken to her at the army hospital, Doohan recalls her saying, "Don't tell his mother that he's gone. She will not be able to bear it." His mother, Baisama, had not stopped praying. Courage has many shades. The unbelievably strong-willed L.N.K. Koppad added another shade to it, says Lieutenant Jen Doohan. The soldier's body was flown to his hometown in Karnataka, where his final resting place, a samadhi near his home in Betadur, became a site protected by a metal gate and fence. 11 months later, on Army Day 2017, Mahadevi arrived in Delhi to attend the parade and receive her husband's posthumous Sena Medal. With little Netra in tow, she was briefly the center of attention at the Army Chief's residence that evening, at a reception attended by the President of India and members of the government. Mahadevi had been sitting quietly in a corner with her daughter. She can do what she likes, but I hope she will grow up to be an army officer and be posted in Siachen. Mahadevi smiles. I know they don't send women up there. But Netra is still young. That will change when she's old enough.